Hello, my name is Kyle Allender, and in this video, I will be presenting the foundation of my philosophy. Philosophy is the search for wisdom, and there are various branches of philosophy which include metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. However, I'm going to assume that the viewers have a basic understanding of what philosophy is. And so, for those who are unaware, I would advise people to watch Joe Smith's videos about what the basics of philosophy are. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to be outlining the core and foundation of how my philosophy works. Too many people seem to misunderstand the thought processes I go through when doing philosophy. And so I think that such a video would help clarify things, and so that would be the goal. Before I begin, it is first important to point out that there are very few positions in philosophy that can be considered undisputable. If you put 3 philosophers in a room, then you may not be able to get them to agree that there are even 3 philosophers in the same room. However, I do not think that philosophical practices are hopeless exercises. I am, after all, getting my bachelor's degree in philosophy. And so, as someone who studies it, I can thoroughly say that philosophy has been a big part of my personal life. And so, for that reason, it does not matter if there are some viewers which don't find my philosophy convincing. My only goal is to get more people to think about what I have to say about these topics. And unfortunately, for the purposes of this video, I am not able to offer a comprehensive justification for my position in regards to how philosophy should operate. Time does not exist for me to justify every single proposition I am about to make. So I recommend that the viewers employ the principle of charity with what I will have to say in this video. With that in mind, let's first establish what I believe is the proper relationship between science and philosophy. Traditionally, philosophy has been the first knowledge approach, where you start off with one's ontology, metaphysics, and epistemology to dictate what someone thinks exists and how one knows about what exists, prior to the doing of any scientific method. In other words, what you think exists will determine how you investigate what exists, and so metaphysics and ontology will come prior to one's epistemology. And so what you think exists will determine what types of questions one will ask, and so will determine the epistemological views one holds. It is argued that the methodology of science will be dependent upon certain epistemological commitments about what can be known. Epistemology will then, in turn, depend upon a set of ontological commitments in which it will be decided about which things can exist, and therefore be the proper objects of your epistemology and how science is to be done. However, my philosophy completely rejects this typical idea. I do not believe that metaphysics comes prior to one's epistemology, in which the philosopher will dictate how the scientist does science. Rather, the relationship between science and philosophy, at least when they are done well, is mutually interactive. I take it that one's ontology, epistemology, and metaphysics should fundamentally be informed by the contents of scientific practice. Now, before I begin, it is helpful to first define what I mean by science. When I'm talking about science, I am not talking about scientific institutions, and I am not talking strictly about the science which builds our best empirical theories. As I've said in a previous video on this channel, we can use the tools of science to build metaphysical theories, as there are certain things that cannot in principle be solely explained by empirical theories. I went over in my previous video how, regarding the intrinsic nature of matter, empirical theories would be silent, since empirical theories only study the structures and relations that exist, and not their intrinsic properties or their intrinsic nature. Furthermore, I pointed out various problems in regards to brute facts, and how taking a strictly scientific naturalist approach will not work. There are too many inconsistent methodologies one has to employ to take this approach to metaphysics. The very claim that science only studies natural entities is, metaphysically speaking, an ontologically neutral claim, and so it cannot in principle be a theory about ultimate reality. There are also dilemma problems when it comes to justifying scientific naturalism as an epistemological and methodological view, as well as claims about brute facts and necessities. To solve these problems, I propose that instead of saying that we should only be interested in what our best empirical theories claim, we can take the virtues that science employs and apply them to metaphysical hypotheses that do make claims about ultimate reality. So metaphysical hypotheses will be underdetermined when it comes to what the empirical methods of science can show. But they become less underdetermined if we properly set up the most internally consistent metaphysical theories that follow the same type of criteria we use to judge scientific theories. The core structure of judging science is very much essential to metaphysics as well. And since metaphysics also includes ontology, then that will be dictated by it as well. The virtues of science are just universal principles and virtues of thinking and reason. We're using the same tools, just applying them in different contexts. In this case, the context between grand metaphysical theories of reality and our best empirical theories. And don't worry, I will address how my approach can solve skeptical scenarios, such as Plato's cave, a brain in a vat, the evil demon thought experiment, or any other number of endless hypothetical scenarios. Since once we have applied the virtues to metaphysical theories that do deal with the true nature of reality, then we are able to escape these scenarios and so provide the most accurate account of reality. I will get more into these virtues of science in a moment, but the way that I like to think about it is that we start off with the virtues of science. These virtues serve as universal principles of thinking and reason, and then philosophy helps us to build the models in which we can organize our concepts. The scientific virtues will then test those organized concepts and models, and then philosophy responds by revising its epistemic, ontological, and metaphysical concepts in light of those virtues. Now, the first question we need to ask is why start off with methodology and these virtues? My response is that we don't start off with premises about what exists and what can be known, and then from them deduce these scientific virtues. But rather, we begin with methodological modes of thought, from which, with this methodology, we organize our philosophical concepts. Ontology and epistemology do not come prior to science, but rather they respond to it. While philosophy has historically preceded science, I think that science, at its core, has been around much longer than humans or any society. Before I get into why I think science has been around longer than philosophy, however, it is important to lay out the virtues of science. The virtues of science are what I will term the Big Four reason-based operational criteria, or the Big Four for short. These four criteria are the operations and foundations of reason, as well as science, and they are the ultimate foundation of my philosophy. The first of these criteria is explanatory predictive accuracy. The criteria requires us to expect with accuracy many and varied events, which we observe. This means any theory that we build must be able to explain phenomena in the proper way, and that this requires that the theory accurately predicts phenomena. The second of these criteria is explanatory simplicity. This criteria can be broken up into two main parts. The first of these parts is what is termed parsimony. Parsimony includes both quantitative parsimony, which is that, all else being equal, an explanation that posits fewer individual entities is preferable to an explanation that posits more. And then there is qualitative parsimony, which is that, all else being equal, an explanation that posits fewer kinds of entities is preferable to an explanation that posits more. Additionally, parsimony is important for both Occam's razor and Occam's laser. Occam's razor is the idea that we should not posit unnecessary entities beyond necessities. And Occam's laser is that we should not posit unnecessary fundamental entities beyond necessity. The second part for explanatory simplicity is about the simple unification between models. This basically means that given our total model of reality, which is all of the webs of inferential relations that exist that constitute our base of knowledge, it be synthesized as closely as possible in order to produce a more comprehensive body of knowledge. In other words, within a set of explanation, there is a simple root or fact that unifies the set of explanations. With a metaphysical theory, this sets up the final stopping point of explanation, where all will converge into one source which predicts the phenomena and can be unified. A grand theory of reality, positing the fewest fundamental entities, would accomplish simple unification, and this would naturally simplify the entire theory, and thus simplify the lower level phenomena that it is explaining. The best kind of stopping point for explanation is an explanation in terms of the simplest kind of entity, with the simplest kind of properties and features, as well as the explanation that stops with a kind of thing with the simplest internal structure. And so, the theory which has the best simple unification is the model that leaves us with the least amount of explanatory questions, and is able to provide the most converged and unified explanation without entailing extra complexity. So in summary, explanatory simplicity is the demand for parsimony at the level of individual models, and simple unification at the level of the total grand model of reality. Explanatory simplicity requires we posit the fewest fundamental explanatory regularities, and fewest fundamental sources of explanation, so that we are left with the fewest unanswerable explanatory questions, and left with the most simplicity in the total theory. The third criteria is ideal explanatory flexibility. What this means is that the model is able to respond to evidence and be modified accordingly. Ideal explanatory flexibility negotiates between two extremely undesirable properties possessed by bad models or theories. The first of these extremes, regarding bad theories, is a theory that is extremely hostile towards modification. This is a theory which dogmatically maintains its commitments about the world, even in the face of strong contradictory evidence. Such a model is unresponsive to evidence because it is unable to be extended to account for new data that contradicts its core commitments. And so the model is not able to grow our body of knowledge. More about the growing of body of knowledge in a moment. The second extreme, regarding a bad theory, is a theory that is so flexible that it becomes ad hoc. A theory that incorporates every contradictory piece of evidence into its program by interpreting that evidence in an ad hoc fashion to give a deceptive appearance that the theory's predictions have been fulfilled is a theory that is not ideally flexible. Such a model or theory is also unresponsive to evidence, because there is no conceivable input of evidence that will alter the model's theoretical output. A theory with too much flexibility is a theory which has the theoretical viciousness of being ad hoc. An ad hoc theory is a theory which artificially adds additional assumptions, and these assumptions are not themselves derivable from other contents within the theory. Models which share these two extreme characteristics are models that are popularly termed unfalsifiable. A model that has ideal explanatory flexibility is a model that negotiates between these two extremes, and meets the demand for it to be responsive to evidence. A model which has ideal explanatory flexibility is a model that does not blindly ignore contradictory evidence, nor does it try to recontextualize its contradictory evidence in an ad hoc fashion. Such a model would respond to contradictory evidence either by recontextualizing its own contents and commitments to accommodate to new evidence via the process called paradigm shifting, or being thrown out altogether through the process called falsification. A model that has ideal explanatory flexibility is a model that is able to grow our total body of knowledge, or what is popularly termed as a research project. The continued development of scientific theories today, for example, are done because of the empirical models that have ideal explanatory flexibility. Our models were able to accommodate new evidence without ad hoc viciousness, and so it expanded our total body of knowledge. This leads to more comprehensive theories that explain more data and to be viable research projects. If our models held onto its dogmatic commitments in light of contradictory evidence, then we could have never expanded our body of knowledge to explain new evidence. And if our models became ad hoc to the point where we kept on building in additional assumptions to explain new evidence, then we would have to posit the very things we are trying to explain. For every contradictory piece of evidence, a new assumption would have to be added, where the added assumption was not at all derivable from the theory's original fundamental commitments. And so, we would not be able to expand our body of knowledge in either case. So in summary, a theory which has ideal explanatory flexibility is a model that is able to respond to evidence in a way that doesn't demand it to ignore evidence, and doesn't demand any extra ad hoc assumptions be built into the model. And so the model is able to expand our body of knowledge. The fourth and final criteria is simply rational coherence, which is that the model has no internal contradictions, and that the model is rational and coherent, and that the model doesn't entail any absurdities. This means that the entailment of a theory does not imply the theory's own falsity, and that the theory is internally consistent with its own contents. These operational criteria are methodological in their nature. I claim that the only sorts of things whose existence we are allowed to posit, or our ontology, are models of reality that are compliant with the Big Four. And the only things that count as knowledge, which is our epistemology, are models which follow the Big Four operational criteria. The Big Four reason-based operational criteria are the foundation of my philosophy and the foundation of all scientific practice, because they define the limits of reason and define what we can posit and know, both within our total metaphysical theories of reality as well as our empirical scientific theories. These criteria do not commit one to any prior ontological, metaphysical, or epistemological presuppositions, since they are the foundation of judging all those theories in the first place. If one holds to any ontological, metaphysical, or epistemological view, they are holding those beliefs in the context of a larger theory. So the criteria for judging such theories are the Big Four operational criteria. This leads us back to our previous question. Why start off with methodology and these virtues, and why think that these virtues are the very foundation of all philosophy? Well, for starters, I take it that philosophy to be about theory building. Philosophy, at its core, is about organizing our concepts about the world. These concepts are then put together in a coherent manner and can be linked together into theories. Philosophy, in my mind, is just the practice of organizing a set of concepts to work in unison. And once we have linked certain concepts, regardless if they are metaphysical concepts, epistemological concepts, or ethical concepts, all of these concepts, regardless of which branch of philosophy it will be part of, will be organized in a fashion in which different linking structures of the concepts will represent different theories. As an example, let's say one presents a philosophical argument that leads to a conclusion. Well, a lot of the time, an argument will have a set of beliefs that someone holds, and those beliefs are part of a certain web of beliefs. The beliefs will be part of a larger worldview, and much of the time, certain beliefs will entail other beliefs until you get a web of beliefs that represents your total worldview. Different concepts will form different linking structures, and thus form different theories and worldviews. These theories will then have a certain number of disagreements between them that make the theories incompatible with one another. When this takes place, the theories that are incompatible with each other will become competitors. These competitive theories represent competitive worldviews, if they are to be the total theories of the world. And this, I would say, is the origin of our worldviews. Worldviews are nothing but total theories of reality that try to coherently organize our philosophical concepts, regardless if these concepts are metaphysical, epistemological, or ethical. So the Big Four operational criteria can be used to judge worldviews, as worldviews are fundamentally just total theories of reality. I should make it clear that these criteria don't just apply to the models that you will find in your science textbook, nor will these criteria just apply to metaphysical theories, or even your total theory, that is your worldview. I'm talking about the models that you are constantly generating every time your mental processes are responding to certain data that you are receiving and organized with. Every second that you are using your basic skills of reasoning, or every second of every day that you receive certain sense data that your mind is organizing, it will be put into a certain model that you can apply to your environment. The Big Four operational criteria simply restricts the ontology and epistemology of what can be properly said to exist and constitute our knowledge. I see it that there are certain experiences that I am having, and that I use those experiences to model the world. I am given a certain direct acquaintance with the idea that I am currently having experiences. Direct acquaintance is an unmediated, conscious mental relation which holds between a mind and some object of awareness. The models that I generate from this can either be individual models that are meant to explain a small set of experiences, or the model can be a grand model, and this grand model will be my total worldview. The operational criteria, then, do not operate from some a priori notion of what exists or what can be known, for rather they stem from pragmatic considerations with my ability to coherently organize my philosophical concepts into a worldview. Even with the theory of direct acquaintance, that theory is simply a consequence of the pragmatic considerations of building a coherent model of acquiring my basic knowledge. The first criteria is simply that my model or worldview has discernible consequences, and then must be applicable in the sense that my worldview can explain my experiences. If my worldview, or total theory, is not able to have explanatory predictive accuracy, then it is useless. The second criteria is the demand that my models have explanatory simplicity, that the contents of my total theory don't get boggled down into unnecessary posits, since my ability to process information is limited, and a worldview with unnecessary baggage will be more susceptible to errors and may lack simple unification. The third criteria, which is ideal explanatory flexibility, is that my models are accountable and are able to respond to evidence. If I'm trying to model the world and take on models which are unable to respond to evidence, then such a model would lead me to more false beliefs, and such a model would not allow me to grow my body of knowledge. This criteria helps to filter out beliefs which may turn out to be more likely false, since it makes my model able to respond to evidence accordingly, so that I can grow my body of knowledge. The fourth criteria is simply that my model is internally coherent and is free of contradictions. This leads me, of course, to three important questions. First is, why think that the criteria have been around longer than philosophy? After all, doesn't philosophy predate science? While it is true that philosophy does predate science, at least in the way that we understand science as social institutions, there are good reasons to think that the criteria have always been part of our basic subconscious cognitive processes. For example, let's say that I come across a tiger. If I have a certain model, and if my model is not able to predict accurately where the tiger will attack, then I'm likely to be faced with a consequence that could lead to my death. If my model doesn't have explanatory simplicity because my ability to process the model has been overloaded with unnecessary posits, then I might also be faced with a consequence that could lead to my death. If my model doesn't have ideal explanatory flexibility because it is unresponsive to evidence, since it either dismisses the evidence by me thinking that the tiger is an illusion, or because it requires that I add additional ad hoc assumptions to account for new evidence, then it could lead to my death. Finally, if my model is not able to be coherent because it is filled with contradictions or entails absurdities, then it could lead to my death. So even when we have basic models of the world, without ever really thinking about it, we are still using the Big Four operational criteria. The point is that these criteria were not taught by philosophers. They are our basic processes of reasoning. The ability to test models with these criteria have been around for billions of years, by not just humans, but also animals and any living organism. And so the virtues of science, as well as philosophy, were not made by philosophers, but rather they have always been part of our reason-based processes and are not dependent upon any society, philosophical theory, or even language. The criteria are the foundation of all these things. And so even if the organisms have no awareness of the operational criteria, these criteria are still being used subconsciously by them in order to help in survival, as the criteria are built into the cognitive processes from nature, and not from any philosopher. The ability to use the criteria came first, prior to any philosophy and prior to any language. Philosophy, as we know it, came later because language came later, and so we were able to communicate our organization of philosophical concepts. And this, of course, led to questions in regards to what exists and what can be known. Once the criteria were applied to philosophy in regards to about what exists and what can be known, then the philosophers and theologians used their models of the world to build their worldviews. Their worldviews, of course, represent the total model in which the criteria applies towards. And as I said before, I believe that the relationship between the criteria, or the Big Four operational criteria, and philosophy is a mutually beneficial partnership where the Big Four will apply to the models that philosophy builds, and then the virtues, or the Big Four, will test the models, and then philosophy will reorganize its concepts, such as its epistemic and ontological contents, to respond to it being more compliant with the Big Four. Second question is that given this view, then what is the ontology and nature of evidence? The ontology and nature of evidence will depend upon any particular theory about epistemic justification. In this case, the criteria for epistemic justification will have to be compliant with the criteria. However, since there are various different theories about the nature of evidence, the simplest take would be that evidence is phenomena which can be better explained on one model over another, and so evidence will be the kind of thing which a model can explain. Something can only be evident or epistemically justified if it is part of the best explanation available, or simply a logical or epistemic consequence of any model. Of course, the model which is the best model is the model which follows the criteria best. This evidence can include certain reasons. Now, of course, answers to the question of what reasons or what good reasons falls into disputes between psychologism and anti-psychologism. The former holds that evidence consists of psychological items, while the latter holds that evidence consists of non-psychological items. One can hold any of these views, but the criteria, or the Big Four, will still, in any case, be the main judge in deciding between the different theories of epistemic justification. And finally, how can these criteria help to respond to skeptical scenarios? Well, when it comes to skeptical scenarios such as Plato's cave, brain in a vat, the matrix, the evil demon hypothesis, and so on, it is important to point out that when these scenarios are brought up to people who posit them, they are trying to provide an alternative model of the world. When trying to explain our sense data, these skeptical scenarios try to provide an alternative explanation for our sensory experiences. Consider the example of holding a billiard ball. You have sensations of a spherical object, and these sensations come to you involuntarily, spontaneously. The external realist, or the one who holds the more common sense view, would say that the explanation of these sensations is an actual three-dimensional spherical object. If a skeptical scenario is to better explain the evidence, then it needs to make it more likely consistent that there are constant regularities of our sensations, as well as positing the fewest entities. With explanatory simplicity, which concerns the number of fundamental explanatory regularities, the common sense explanation is superior to these skeptical scenarios, since it appeals to necessary truths of geometry and various spatial-temporal properties. And the skeptical scenario has to posit additional contingent fundamental regularities. Let's say that there are 3 houses arranged in a triangular pattern. If the common sense explanation is true, then these 3 houses actually occupy an objective public environment. And so, in order for the skeptical scenario to explain all of these sense data, then it must posit some fundamental regularity in addition to those that it shares with the common sense explanation. And so the reason that these houses do not have genuine spatial location is because they are patterns in the demon's mind. In order for the skeptical scenario to explain what the common sense view does, it would need to posit additional fundamental regularities. And finally, any skeptical scenario will involve more unanswerable explanatory questions. The unanswerable explanatory questions that these skeptical scenarios raise stem from the fact that we actually have to posit these things to exist. As an example, if we are brains in a vat, or if we are in the matrix, or if there is an evil demon that is deceiving us, then we will have to posit such additional things to explain our experiences. Of course, there is more posits on those type of hypotheses. And so there are good reasons to find that we can judge these skeptical scenarios using the virtues, and that the Big Four operational criteria cannot just apply to empirical theories, but they must also be used in response to skeptical scenarios. Once one considers how to infer the best explanation by using the Big Four criteria, then it can provide evidence that favors a common sense view against these skeptical scenarios. Another consideration is to take into account the fact that the only sort of evidence that we can't have against these various skeptical hypotheses is to actually use the virtues in the first place. Since it is the case that we cannot rule out these skeptical alternative hypotheses on the basis of sensory evidence alone, and that we cannot rule out these skeptical scenarios based solely on empirical theories alone, then this provides us another reason why we must use these virtues beyond empirical theories of science. And so if we consider the fact that these skeptical scenarios are themselves theory-dependent, as is the same with all philosophy, then we can still use the criteria to judge these skeptical scenarios. Since philosophy is theory-dependent, then one would need to do a theory-theory comparison to see if these skeptical scenarios even work. A total theory, or worldview, can strictly entail the falsity of these skeptical scenarios. And so, skeptical scenarios cannot be used against theories which follow the operational criteria, since if those theories do make claims about the true nature of ultimate reality, and those claims tell the falsity of skeptical scenarios, then one needs to actually argue against a certain theory by showing that the theory does not properly follow the criteria, and that there is a better theory that is more compliant with the Big Four. And so if it just falls out of the theory that such skeptical scenarios are false, then these skeptical scenarios will necessarily be false within the context of the theory. Of course, one may think that this is question-begging in favor of one's total theory. But it is also the case that the skeptic, when presenting these skeptical scenarios, is question-begging against someone's theory that entails the falsity of these skeptical scenarios. In other words, if your theory entails that skeptical scenarios are false, then that will alone be an adequate response to the epistemological skeptic, and the epistemological skeptic will need to provide a better theory. So regardless of any number of skeptical scenarios, it is clear that the Big Four operational criteria not only apply to our basic reasoning, and not only apply to our empirical theories, and not only do they apply to our metaphysical theories, but they can be used as an adequate response to epistemological skepticism. So in conclusion, this is the foundation of my philosophy. First is that I am given a certain direct acquaintance with the idea that I am currently having experiences. Direct acquaintance is an unmediated, conscious mental relation which holds between a mind and some object of awareness. In order for me to properly model these experiences, I must build a model. The model can help to derive not only a theory about my direct acquaintance, but also any theory or worldview that I form. In order for me to navigate my environment and to organize my philosophical concepts into a worldview, my model or worldview must conform to the Big Four operational criteria. And these criteria will dictate what I am allowed to believe about what exists, as well as what I can ultimately know about. Furthermore, as I've argued in this video, the origins of these criteria do not come from any society, nor were they invented by any philosopher. Rather, they are a basic part of our subconscious reason-based processes, as they are universal rules of reason that can be used to create the best models of the world. These models can include anything from the mundane models that we come up with in order to help us survive, as well as the models that have helped to inform our total worldview, in which our worldviews can inform our thoughts and actions. Now once again, time does not permit me to answer every single objection that can be brought up against my view about the role that philosophy ultimately plays. But I hope that I can be clear that my philosophy, in a nutshell, starts with this basic process of theory building, and that there are criteria we use to judge the theories and worldviews that we build in philosophy. And so, that concludes this video. And I hope you all now have a good understanding about what I think is the ultimate foundation for all philosophy.